episode 82 of the Power Score LSAT podcast. I'm Dave Kaloran in Napa Valley.
And I'm Jon Dinning in Los Angeles.
John, today we're here to talk about the 2022 U.S. News and World Report Law School rankings.
I don't know, but I'm here to talk about basketball. I don't know what you're on about.
Are.
Yeah.
You can go ahead and talk to me about basketball since I am leading the NCAA pool.
Let's talk about those rankings.
I had a feeling your tune would change.
Yeah. As
Although
well as my
things could get a
basketball
little
knowledge,
tighter.
by the way. The conversation would have been equally short if you asked me if I knew anything about the tournament.
Well, I have that Michigan-UCLA game recording, and so ultimately we'll see how that turns out because that will help you narrow the gap and others on me.
Yeah.
But
Michigan, Baylor, Gonzaga. If there's anybody out there rooting for me, put that into the universe.
well, I guess I have to take UCLA, Houston, and Gonzaga, so sorry.
It's okay. Go Gonzaga. We got that in common.
Yeah, we do have them. All right. Well, let's move forward and talk a little bit about the usual things, which is, what are you drinking tonight?
Well, along with some jealousy over your drink choice, which we'll get to, I've been watching basketball the past couple of days, and it brought back old memories of just like basketball stadiums, when you could actually go. And so I tried to think of a good stadium beer. That was my inspiration. And I settled on Lagunitas. I didn't want to quite go Bud Light, but that's what I've got here. There's a can of Lagunitas still in the can.
That's a good beer.
I like it.
I think they serve that up here at San Francisco's ballpark.
I'm sure I've had it there with you. Maybe not at the ballpark, but somewhere.
Yeah, not at AT&T. Usually when I'm out at like a game, I'm gonna drink usually Miller Lite, so I can drink a lot of it.
Fair enough. Yeah, I forget what we were drinking at the Yankees game we went to a couple years back, but probably Miller Lite.
I think it was that. Yeah, Yankees Twins.
Good
Interesting
memory.
game up in the Bronx.
Yeah.
But we've kind of done a little high-low thing because, of course, rankings are all about high and low. You've gone a little more low end. I've gone high end because A, rankings, and B, because a couple weeks ago someone was like, when are you going to drink some really good California wine? I was like, oh, I can pull out some good bottles. So tonight I am drinking the Realm Huyi Cabernet, which is not an easy bottle to get. I was hooked up by a friend who actually worked at Realm, and that is a great winery if you're not familiar with it. And Huyi is an amazing vineyard up in Pritchard Hill, which is in Napa Valley and is really kind of like a underrated appellation that's there. So this is quite good. It's a high-level Cabernet, very complex. I must say I'm enjoying it quite a bit, John.
Well, nothing tops my Lagunitas, but I'm happy you're happy.
Right now I'm drinking Yale.
Yeah.
I'm not sure what you're drinking.
I won't name a school because it's going to be so far down the list, but it's not a tier 1. Let's put it that way.
Let's move on from that. There's a degree of, I don't know, in the midst of that I want to get away from.
Yeah.
We won't be.
Again, we won't be insulting schools tonight. We're just going to be talking through the numbers.
Yeah, we didn't make the rankings.
Right.
This is U.S. News making the rankings, and we're just here to report on what happened and maybe to talk a little bit about it and maybe to kind of ease some people's minds about the way rankings work and the degree of arbitrariness that is shot through all of this.
Yeah.
But first,
we
had to go back to the low end. I guess that might be an insult to this music, but I think it's more gritty, rock driven.
Unless you mean like bass heavy, in which case, yeah. Very kick drum. That's the low end.
3 chords is, I don't think, advanced.
You suggested this song, and as soon as I saw it, I was like, that's the one. And it's A Long Way to the Top is the name of the song by, of course, the inimitable AC/DC.
And, of course, it was a rankings thing.
Yeah.
A Long Way to the Top is exactly how I feel the rankings must be for a lot of schools. Although, I'm going to be honest, I probably had 20 songs that we could have chosen for this. We did Van Halen recently, and I could think of a bunch of Van Halen songs. Running with the Devil, because the rankings are devilish. Everybody Wants Some, because everybody wants to get in there and move up. Even The Cradle Will Rock, because in the middle of that song, he says, have you seen Junior's grades? Which reminded me of rankings. We could have gone just Van Halen and had 3 great choices, and there were a ton of others from the Doors to whoever and Stones and so forth.
Yeah.
But AC/DC was it. And we're going to link the video to this, which is from a 1976 TV show in Australia, and I find it absolutely hilarious to watch. And I've seen it a bunch. So if you're an AC/DC fan, go watch it. If you're not, you might actually appreciate them more because I think early AC/DC is the best AC/DC for me.
Yeah, well, there's not a whole lot of early Bon Scott AC/DC, unfortunately. He died at 33. I think he died in 1980, if memory serves. So you're going to watch one of his final-ish performances in the final 4 years or so of his life.
And then they replaced him with Brian Johnson.
Yeah, they did, who I respect a great deal because he's still out there trucking. Did you see that documentary he put out in 2017 or so called A Life on the Road? I think it's on Amazon. But he has guys from like The Who, Deep Purple. He had Peter Frampton on, and he just interviews them, and they tell rock and roll stories. It's amazing if you're into that sort of thing.
And I am, but I haven't seen it, so I'll have to check it out.
Yeah, it's worth your time. Anyway, that's on Amazon. Go look it up.
The fact that he still has a voice and can speak sometimes amazes me.
Yeah, he played with Muse like 2 years ago. They came out and did
right.
something Thunderstruck, I think. Yeah.
Yes, and they often do little AC/DC riffs in the middle of their concerts, as you and I both know.
Yeah.
Anyway, enough of the drinking and the rock. Let's move on to the LSAT world.
Blasphemy, but let's move on.
Unfortunate.
Yeah, first things first is right around the corner for us, the April LSAT. It is looming. It'll be here in about a week and a half after this recording.
That's right, and they just sent the email out today for the sign-up for times. And if I recall correctly, you've got Saturday and Sunday, the 10th and the 11th, and then Tuesday, the 13th, are the 3 primary days. And there will be other days as well for accommodations and so forth. So make sure you choose one of those times. If you haven't already, there's usually plenty of options available.
Yeah, to clarify, you can't pick your time yet. The email today specified what the times would look like. You can pick your time this Thursday, probably tomorrow based on when this goes out. So the April 1st is when you can pick.
Getting ahead of myself. Excited about it.
Me too. It's easy to do.
For a minute, I actually thought it was Thursday, so I'm all turned around.
I wish it was Thursday. But we did actually record an episode, I think it was episode 69 in our podcast, that talked all about how to pick the best time for you. Pros and cons of the different days, morning, afternoon, how to select it, what to do. So if you're unsure, or even if you're 99% sure, that degree of uncertainty can make a big difference. Go listen to that. It'll really help you make the right call.
Yeah, and as usual, I've already been asked this question, but we will do a test recap podcast episode that week of the test, probably Wednesday, based upon what I'm seeing here. Conceivably Tuesday night, but I think it would be out Wednesday. If there's some issues, maybe it would be Thursday if they actually extend the test window, but I don't think they're going to do that. And also, once you've taken the test, feel free to let us know how it went. We have an LSAT form that is free where we post a thread that talks about how was your test experience, and you can always feel free to contact us on Twitter and let us know how it went, or even on Reddit.
On Reddit too, yeah.
We'd love to hear it.
Well, there we go. And then we get down to, if you're a Flex fan, the end of the road. We've got June coming up after April. And that is the last Flex test. We've talked about this before, but if you're looking to get your foot in the door of Flex, you've only got one more shot at this point to sign up. And that's for June. We don't know exactly when that test is going to run. We know the week, but we don't know the exact days yet. They'll specify that, much as they've just done for April, probably 10 days or so in advance. But we know that that test is going to start on Saturday, June 12th.
Yeah, and you have until April 30th to register for that test, and then they'll do the score release on July 1st. So for some people, that'll actually be decisively helpful in terms of being on a wait list. If they're still sitting on a wait list in July, and many people will be, you can use that LSAT score to actually get off the wait list. In fact, we have not a podcast, but a blog called the June LSAT and the Law School Waitlist that talks about students in past years using that exam to improve their position. So that's an option as well. So that'll be the last of the Flex tests, and then the next LSAT after that will be August, and then we'll have the new 4-section format with 3 scored sections and 1 experimental section, and a new day will dawn at that point.
Although they don't want us to give a new name to it, so it'll just be the LSAT in August. but
I'm going to start calling it the new
how
LSAT.
are
I
we
think I'm going
not?
to ignore this.
Yeah, it's too confusing otherwise. But anyway, in August, you will not have a flex test. You will have a flex plus one.
Yeah, the old LSAT, I think I will call LSAT Classic, just like Coke
Just
Classic.
Coke, yeah.
Then we have the LSAT Flex, and then we're going to have the new LSAT for a while to kind of distinguish between these things. And of course, we'll be there talking about all those changes again this summer as they kind of are coming down the pipeline. And just a reminder to everybody that if you like this podcast, there's probably a pretty good chance that you'll like our LSAT preparation books, courses, and tutoring as well. So if you're new to this, and a lot of the listeners that we're getting right now are, check those out when you get a chance. But let's move to the main event at this point, which is the newly released 2022 U.S. News Law School rankings.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll be honest, John, here it is. It's March 30th today. They've just released them. They released them last night, actually. It's 2021, and I hate how they call them 2022. It's so far in advance. I don't think you should be able to do this until like the last quarter of the year.
Yeah, it's like car makers do this. You can already buy a 2022 Chevy or something. It's like, come on, guys.
Stupid.
But there it is. It's a little like the LSAC calendar as well, where it starts in June and then resets in May. It's like, what kind of Mayan nonsense is this? But there you go. That's what they do.
Arbitrary calendaring. I dislike it. Well, let's talk about these rankings because, they're always controversial when they come out, but this year may be fraught with even more controversy. They've had multiple changes in the weeks running up to this. They were changing them as little as 2 days or 3 days ago. And we'll talk about what that means and why you need to be really careful about rankings, and also how what appears to be a really significant move, and we'll note some of those significant moves as we talk about this, isn't necessarily significant. So let's first talk about some of the issues that we've run through, talk about some of the things that affect the rankings, then we'll look at the rankings themselves, and then we'll go through the winners and losers in this year's rankings, which I think John and I are both looking forward to because that sounds like fun.
Yeah. Aside from the beer and the music, that's easily going to be my favorite part of this.
It's very NCAA tournament, and obviously we've got that going on right now, and that's pretty exciting. So I like it.
I like it too. Tell me what some of these errors were. Walk me through some of these.
The recalculations that we've seen have been disturbing. I understand what's going on. U.S. News wanted to introduce some new ways to measure schools and to perhaps separate them out. But they had 3 recalculations because of various problems, errors, or complaints that they received. Mm-hmm. So let's start with the first one. They've created a new diversity rankings component. And initially, this was part of the rankings. They wanted to show which schools were the most diverse. Now, there were so many problems with this that I can tell you right now that they have broken that segment out and they have pushed it back. So we don't have the diversity rankings. They were not included this time. They're supposed to come out at some point. I don't know whether that's a few weeks, a few months. If I was them, I'd probably want to put a little space between what they're doing right now and the outcome there. So this was a new thing, and as they discovered after kind of getting into the data, they had not accounted for Asian students as being underrepresented or as being diversity students in any sense of the word. And so there were complaints about that, and they acknowledged that and said, all right, we're going to change it. So they did that. Well, then they had a second problem, which was that it turned out that if somebody reported as being multiracial, they weren't being counted. So it was kind of like if you reported one thing, then you were okay. But if you reported 2 or more, they didn't count you. And so a bunch of law school deans actually got together. I think it was 161 law school deans, wrote a letter to U.S. News protesting this, saying this is completely ridiculous. These students are very diverse. Why wouldn't you include them? And then that caused U.S. News to say, we might have screwed this up. And so that's when they pulled this. So that was the first thing. They tried to introduce something new, ultimately realized that it wasn't working for them because of, I would think, some assumptions they had made in their model. And so they pulled that out entirely. So then we get to the second change, which was that they were trying to account for the number of hours, I guess, that libraries were open. On the theory that the longer your library is open, the better law school you are.
Oh, boy.
I mean, really, your library should be open 24/7 because it's law school. People
Yeah.
study at all crazy hours. But one of the things that was interesting is as they found that they had inaccurate library hours, they went and had a recalculation. And I'm going to use this as an example of how arbitrary these rankings are and how close these schools are, which is one, kind of way for people to see that maybe you want to be careful about how much emphasis and weight you put on these rankings. So the library hours metric is 1/4 of 1%, all right, 0.25 of what we're looking at. So an exceptionally small, 1/400th of the entire ranking. When they went out and recalculated this, it caused 30 schools to change positions. That's, to me, really kind of like a damning statistic right there. That you would have such a small piece, and when you changed it, that you would see so many schools change. And so when you think about this, one of the things that you and I have talked about, John, is the way the rankings make it look so black and white.
Right.
25 is better than 30, and there's just no doubt. 30 is better than 35, and there's no question about it. But that's not the case at all. When you have a library that might be open 3 more hours, and that might move it above a different school, and you try to figure that out. And
Yeah.
obviously, there's so much data here that it's really hard to do it.
Yeah, look, if a 0.25% can change 30 schools' positions, I mean, the fragility of this entire construct becomes pretty self-evident.
Yeah, and I have a lot more to say about this, and I know you do too, but I'll just pause right there and say we'll come back to this in just a minute after we go to the next kind of recalculation problem.
Okay.
So then, just a couple of days ago, on I guess the 28th of March, they sent a message to law schools talking about it was about library teaching and credit hours and the calculation there. And apparently, some schools had reported it differently than other schools. And so they again pulled that out. And this was again 1/4 of 1%. And they just took care of that entirely. They just eliminated it and put that on bar passage. And so even though this was just 1/4 of 1%, and it took the library portion of the calculations down to 1.75%, and it pushed the bar passage and related elements up to 2.25%, guess how many changes there were from that?
I don't have to guess because I know, but I can tell you it was even more than the library hours. There were 35 schools that saw changes based on this one.
35. Now, no schools in the top 20 were affected by this, but 9 schools saw their rankings change in the 21 to 30 segment. And again, so when you start looking at schools and you're like, well, wait a second, this school's 21 and this one's 25, they're really the same. There's giant bands here that we are actually looking at as opposed to an ordinal 1, 2, 3, 4. U.S. News has chosen to do it this way, and it's great for them. It's controversy. People can talk about it. Here we are debating it. But really, they should just have these tiers where the top 6 schools should be one tier, then the next 8 to 10 schools, and so on. That would probably be a lot better of a way to have done this. But, they're not taking my phone calls about it.
Yeah, there's several ways to do it that are better than, whole digit numbering. That's for sure.
Yeah, or if you really wanted to show the actual kind of like the outcome and allow people to realize, wow, that school beat that other school out by half a point.
Mm-hmm.
Is that really significant? Should I go to that school instead of this other school that I love so much? Probably not.
Yeah, the degree of overlap, I'm seeing circles along kind of a unmarked number line. How much they,
Yeah.
overlap versus how far they're apart.
So let's go back to kind of like the disclaimers and notes and talk a little bit more about the value of these rankings and exactly how much stock you should put in them. You've seen now incredibly small changes in things like library hours and the number of credit hours taught by librarians can have multiple effects, dozens of effects on the rankings, even though it's just a really, really tiny piece. And so those big differences aren't there. They are typically very small. Now, I'm not saying that Yale isn't significantly different than, say, the 100th school that's out there. So it's not like the top and the bottom are all the same. But as you go through each kind of band, you start to see more similarities than actual differences. And John, the thing that reminded me of was the NCAA tournament.
Yeah, I mean, it's on our mind anyway, but I think this is a perfect analogy.
Yeah, you get the idea when you look at the NCAA bracket that, all right, these are the 1 seeds, they're going to win for sure. These are the 2 seeds, the 3 seeds, all the way down to the 16s.
Hmm.
And then you start to realize that pretty much every year a 12 seed beats a 5 seed, and often a 13 beats a 4, and so on. And you realize that those rankings, which are built upon what should be measurables throughout the season, don't actually play out. They largely play out. I mean, if you're the number 1 team in the nation, you're usually going to do well, unless you're Virginia from a couple years ago. Had being a Duke guy, of course, I had to slide the knife in on UVA, but
It's
they did
fair.
win the title the following year, so they have no complaints. I think they'll take that duality there. But it's just really not decisive. And so the thing I always tell students is don't rely on rankings to make decisions about schools. Go into the numbers. Use the ABA reporting 509s and take a look at employment, look at placement, look at geography, the things that are actually going to affect the type of job that you get and see how well they've actually done.
Yeah. Put another way, in much like the seeding of the tournament, the rankings matter, but they don't paint a full picture, certainly. And I think
Nice.
that's where a lot of people get hung up on this. Should I go to the 10th or the 12th ranked school? It's like, it's kind of a coin toss in a lot of ways, much like a 10 playing a 12 in the tournament would be.
Yeah, and I think painting the whole picture, yes, it gives us some measurables here, but at the same time, individual outcomes may vary.
Mhm.
You can go to a top ranked school and not end up doing well, and you can go to a lower ranked school and end up doing fantastically well. The individual isn't being accounted for in these rankings.
Right.
Yeah, we know that the outcomes are taken into account, but the input side is only looked at as far as LSAT and GPA, and I think that's a little bit of a problem. There's other problems as well in terms of what they measure.
Yeah, there's a few different criterion through this that I think deserve a second, or for some people, maybe a first look. I know one of the things that they're using fairly heavily in this, in fact, is an assessment metric on what I'll call reputation, basically. How it is that peers would rank these schools, or lawyers and judges is another group. As they've put it, US News has put it, quote, expert opinions about program excellence, which sounds great until you start to think about what it really means. It feels, once you think about it, quite subjective, especially when put next to hard metrics like the LSAT, GPA, the medians there, employment rates, bar passage, etc., debt. All of these are very measurable things that can stack a school versus another in clear black and white terms. Lawyers and judges' opinions of those schools, that to me, I have a tougher time putting the same kind of stock in.
Well, I mean, you have, let's just say, almost 200 schools out there that are being ranked. You think anybody knows all 200 of them?
That's another good point. Yeah.
There's not many people in general that know a lot about each school. Maybe people who are in admissions, especially people who are doing admissions advising. I feel like I know a fair bit about a lot of schools, but when we get down the list and schools that I maybe don't deal with quite as much, I don't know nearly as much about them as I might know about Penn or Georgetown or what have you. And then the other thing is this is look who they're talking to, lawyers
Okay.
and judges. These aren't necessarily people who are in the mindset of law schools. They went to law school, they're in the legal field, but if you're talking to a judge who's been out of law school for 30, 35 years, what do they actually know? Are they really paying attention to what's happening on the ground? I would say not. And I think they end up falling prey to what I saw someone on Twitter commenting about. They're like, okay, look, I know a bunch of the schools. And if I was asked to do this, I could probably rank the first 25 or 30, maybe even the first 50 pretty well. After that, I'm not so sure. So what do you think I do? That's right, I look it up online. What do I find? The US News rankings. So then all of a sudden, the rankings, it becomes a circular, self proving argument where the rankings that were out there from last year just get used again by these people to kind of like just fill in the remainder.
That's right. Yeah, I can't help but I think it gets overlooked. I can't help but note that one of the things that I don't believe they've used here, and that is probably of the most utility to a potential graduate, is what are the recruitment opinions of these places? I want to go get a job. I may not want to be a judge. I don't care what a judge thinks of the school, but what if I want to work at that firm? What do the associates there, what do the hiring partners there say about it? I don't believe they've been included as part of this, or at least if they have, they haven't been given greater weight. although I bet an applicant would give them greater weight.
I'll reference another Twitter thread that I was reading, and my apologies to whoever wrote it because I can't give them credit here because I just don't remember who it was, but it was on Twitter, and they were saying that they had worked in the O'Melveny and Myers Century City office.
Okay.
And O'Melveny and Myers is a big law firm, and there's various offices in Los Angeles. There's a downtown law office that's like 300 lawyers in it, and the Century City office is a little bit smaller. Century City being very close to Beverly Hills.
I was going to say, I know that office because it's like a mile from me.
Yeah, you can see it.
I can probably see it out the window.
Yeah, there's no doubt about it. But this person was saying that, when you talk about hiring, they know all the LA schools. And so the rankings to them aren't that big of a deal. They know Loyola, they know Pepperdine, and they have preferences. And their preferences in the Century City office are different than those from the Los Angeles office because there's different hiring. They said when you get to the top schools that everybody knows, places like Penn or Duke or Georgetown or Columbia, if they see someone come in, yeah, they're probably likely to interview them because they know them.
Right.
And the problem they run into is they don't go to the rankings to look at schools that are down the list. And in this case, the guy said, if we get an app from, somebody who went to Connecticut, they're not getting an interview. We don't know that school. We're not familiar with it. Its reputation doesn't extend to Los Angeles. They just don't get past the door.
Right.
And that's, there's a much more local component to this in hiring. It's one of the reasons I think that Fordham has done so well for years in big law hiring in New York because they're in New York.
Right there. Yeah, that's a very good point. Anyway, all of this really circles back to the idea of you have to take this stuff with a grain of salt. The way these rankings are assigned may not apply to you. They're definitely not as concrete or finite as they seem. And a lot of the metrics even being used here are, let's call them a bit dubious.
Yeah. Now, let's talk about the new debt measurement that they have tossed in, because I think this is a good thing. Debt is something that should be looked at. And they have added this metric, which is now 5% of the rankings. And so average student debt level of new graduates is 3% total. And then the percent of graduates who leave the law school itself with debt, what overall percentage is 2%. So it's the percentage of people leaving and then how much debt they have when they leave. Those two things are added together. And so I was reading a law.com article on this. It was an excellent article overall. And it was very interesting where she was talking about the idea that as you look at the top 10 schools with the highest graduate debt levels, it's really highly ranked schools, schools like Columbia, for example, and then schools that are essentially not as well ranked. And I think Southwestern was on there. So like the highest debt overall was Chicago. That the debt level is 191,000. Then Southwestern was right after at 190,000. And John, you being in LA, you're familiar with Southwestern.
Well, I'm at least familiar with what things cost, so I'm not surprised by that debt number. And I am very familiar with Southwestern too.
Yeah, and then Columbia is third at 190,000. So it's like some of the really elite schools where people are like, I'm going to pay the full ride. And then some of the schools maybe not as well ranked where people are like, look, I just want to go to school. I'm willing to pay for it. Kind of an interesting mix there, and certainly a really interesting metric.
Yeah.
And I will add to that, we just posted a guest blog today and put it into our free help site as well that goes into category by category breakdowns of the data that we have from U.S. News. And it looks at kind of like the effect that all of this had. It's a massive spreadsheet that we've posted along with some comments. So if you're really interested in diving into this a little bit more, go to our blog. There'll be a link to it by the time this is up. And then on our free help site, you'll be able to see this kind of chart where you can kind of scroll through and take a look at some of the numbers that are underneath all these rankings. But that said, what should we do next, John?
Let's look at the numbers.
Let's get to it.
The bit for this.
The fun part, you mean?
This is the fun part, yeah.
Let's do this in two parts. The first part, we'll do the broad strokes.
Okay.
We'll kind of talk about what's happened with the various levels here through the top 50 or so. And then we're going to do what I am certain will become a yearly feature, the winners and losers. I'm already just jump ahead to that.
Me too. I feel like Joan Crawford on a red carpet. I'm ready to tear some people's outfits apart.
John, why don't you give us a full rundown of every change that we saw in the top 14?
Okay. And this is all relative to last year's rankings for anyone wondering what we're talking about by movement. It's the new ones compared to what we saw last year. So let's just run through them. No surprise, Mr. Consistent, Yale has stayed at number 1. We all saw that coming. Stanford and Harvard have had an interesting back and forth, or they did for a while. Stanford is number 2, as they were last year, so no change. Harvard is number 3 again. I'm sure they're a little bit miffed, but they've been 3 now for about 5 years in a row, after formerly being second, sometimes tied with Stanford. Steady as well as University of Chicago, number 4 again. A little less steady, Columbia, they tend to vacillate between 4 and 5. They tied for 4th this year. No change there. They were 4th last year as well, tied with Chicago. Another steady one is New York, NYU at 6, no change from last year. And now we get a little bit of movement, finally. Penn. Penn moved up from 7th to 6th, so go Penn. 8th is Virginia. Again, Virginia has been all over the map. 2 years ago, they were 6th. The year before that, they were 9th. But this year, as last year, they were 8th. Coming in at 9th was UC Berkeley. They were 9th last year, so no change for them. And now we have our first slide backward. The University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. They were 9th last year. They have slipped back to 10th. In a tie at 10th with Duke. Duke being the big winner here through the top 14. Duke was 12th last year. They've moved up to 10th. So go Dave, go Duke. They are 10 now. That was the biggest gain. The biggest slide through the top 14, the biggest loss here was Northwestern. They were 9th last year, and they have dropped all the way back this year to 12th. So -3 for Northwestern. Cornell, steady as always at 13th, same as last year and the year before, etc. And then at 14, another kind of surprise late entry here was UCLA. They were 15th last year and the year before, 16th the year before that. So they're gaining steadily, and they have just jumped their way into the top 14, supplanting or replacing Georgetown, which I know this stings a little too. Georgetown was 14th 3 years in a row. This year they're 15th, so they lost a spot.
And technically out of the very arbitrarily named, to some extent, T14 or top 14. So let's talk about the T14 in just a second.
Yeah.
The one thing I will say is that Penn moves into the top 6, and the T6 had been something that people talked about a lot. You had the T3, which was Harvard, Yale, and Stanford in some order, so HYS. And then you had the 4 through 6 positions, which was CCN, Columbia, Chicago, and New York. I guess now we've got CCNP for the time being, with Penn moving up. Northwestern slides back down. We'll talk about that momentarily. And then, again, Georgetown, sorry. I wish that I could say that they were still T14. But, John, why do they call it the T14?
Well, I believe that name was applied years ago, and it's just kind of stuck inappropriately because for the longest time, the top 14 were fairly static. You could count on what those schools were going to be more or less year to year. They would trade off a little bit within it, but that was usually why the 14 was the cutoff point. It's like we know at least what that collection is going to be.
Yeah, it was the same schools over and over, and the stability at the top is what lent that name. And then as you went down, you'd start to see a lot more movement in terms of what was happening. And so that's why they use that T14 name. And if you look at the top 6, you see remarkable steadiness. It's the same schools every single year. So the T6 is very stable. The T14, the second half of it, they tend to move around, and we'll highlight that a little bit here in our winners and losers. But that's why they use that T14, and to people outside, it seems weird. Like, why not T15? They may have to, because both UCLA and Texas have slipped into the top 14 in the last several years. And again, Georgetown then fights them off and retakes that 14th position. Let's move to the top 25, and literally what are the ranks 15 through 25. And I'll just highlight the biggest moves. I'm not going to go through each position here. But the first one is a winner. Vanderbilt moves up 2 positions from number 18 and is now number 16. The second is another winner, and that is Florida. We'll talk about them momentarily. Up 3 more places to number 21. Carolina jumps back up. They are now at number 24. And, of course, as a Duke fan, I have to kind of look sideways at that. And then Alabama, who had a big drop last year of 6 positions, jumps back up 6 positions, and they get into the top 25. And so those are really the most notable movements. Everything else within that 15 through 25 was either up 1 or down 1. So those were the only moves that were anywhere more. And you can see Alabama went right.
Redemption, man. Total redemption
For Alabama.
Yeah.
I like how you get Carolina, big basketball school, coming into 24, and then you get Alabama, obviously big football school, coming in at 25. And again, there's a bunch of ties throughout these rankings, which, given all the different measurements, ties always make me laugh. I'm like, isn't the point to separate? But you're not separating. Maybe something's wrong.
Yeah, but when people put these, again, somewhat arbitrary markers on things, think about what that means for Alabama. Alabama went from 31st last year to 25th. They weren't even in the top 30. Now they're in the top 25. People do this with the LSAT too. This is like a 155 to a 162 or something. You've crossed some significant thresholds there.
Yeah, but if you look at the ranking numbers between 25 and 30, they're very, very close. Mm-hmm. It seems like a big jump when we talk about it here, but I can tell you that it is not. And then let's hit the biggest moves in kind of like that 26 through 50 range. You want to hit those, or you want me to?
No, you're on a roll, man. You do it.
Woo! I'm happy to do it. First one is a loser. George Washington down 4 spaces to 27. Then we got a winner in BYU up 8 spaces to number 29. And I'll tell you right now, this has to be in part, if not largely, a result of debt being included. BYU is super cheap, and especially relative to the quality, probably one of the best value law schools out there. And it had overall the single lowest in average indebtedness of $51,000 for people coming out there. So that certainly was helping them out.
Yeah, that was my next question to you. Aren't they the lowest average debt of any school? I believe they are.
Yeah, they are. I don't know that it's the right environment for me or you.
What are you talking about? Please elaborate. I'm just going to turn this AC/DC up real quick.
I've worked with a ton of Mormon students who I love to death. Yeah. They're always great people, but they make commitments that I don't think that I have within me, and I know you don't have within you. So I always tell my students who are looking at BYU, I'm like, great school, great resources there, really well supported. The cost is unbeatable for the value, but you have to make commitments to your lifestyle and to your beliefs that are a little bit different than you see at a lot of other schools. In fact, a lot more different.
You pay in other ways, but for some it's well
worth
it.
Or you benefit. And it's all perspective. I would say you pay. You would say you pay. Other people would say you benefit. So I'm willing to be inclusive of all views on this particular subject. But they were a big winner here, up 8. Wisconsin, and being a Minnesotan, this was to my chagrin, up a 9 spots to number 29. They were another big winner. And then we had what appears to be a loser here, and that was Fordham, down 8 spaces to number 35. And again, I'll point out that's a big drop for them, but not so big when you look at the relative numbers, and certainly was affected by the hiring or lack thereof by big law firms in New York over the last year during the pandemic. We had another loser, UC Irvine, down 8 spaces to 35, just like Fordham. And then last, we'll close out with a winner that jumped into the top 50, a school close to me, relatively speaking, and that is UC Hastings, up 9 spaces to number 50.
Yeah, squeaked right in there. And again, 9 spots, 8 spots, these sound like a lot, but you can see a school like Fordham is still the right choice for a lot of people, whether they're 27 or 35th. Because of location, because of opportunity. And the opportunity shrank, so the ranking dropped. That's all that is.
Yeah, when you look at some, if you have a certain desire, and I think Fordham is incredibly expensive, and it is very likely that the debt had a lot to do with this as well. But they place really well in big law, considering everything. So, mid-20s rank now, mid-30s rank, but their big law placement is really solid, again, because New York firms, and there is a ton of high-level big firms there, they know Fordham. Right. They trust grads at the top of those classes, and they will get jobs. So you have to take a look at things like that and go beyond the ranking, because sometimes people would say, oh, for sure, I'm going to go to Minnesota because it's better ranked than Fordham. But I would think that if we sat down and looked at the big law placement, we might see some differences there. And Minnesota's been very stable in the low 20s in terms of their rankings. you have to make the choice that's best for you when you're looking at this. Don't just use the numbered rankings. As much as I like Minnesota, although I hate the cold, it's not the right school for everybody, and it is definitely the best school for some people.
Yeah, it's a good
That's
point.
the way every one of these schools are.
I was talking to a student maybe 2 weeks ago, so before we knew these new numbers, and she was telling me that her big thing is she wants to move to Southern California. That's why we got to talking about things, and work there after school. And so she was looking, obviously, at schools in the region, and UCI came up, and I was like, they're a great school, mid-20s, et cetera, et cetera. And she said, what if they drop? Now, I didn't know they were going to drop 8 points. But I'm sure we're going to have a follow-up conversation where she's going to ask me that question. Is it still worth it at 35? And to me, the worth it or not really doesn't come down to the difference in those numbers. It comes down to things like debt. It comes down to things like making sure that environment is right for you. But I wouldn't bat an eye at the difference in rank.
Yeah, I think you're well aware of the fact that we have a blog called Scholarship versus Prestige, where I get
Not
a
as aware as
ton
you
of
are.
questions. Yeah, I'm very aware of it. I'm answering questions on there very consistently. And people are always posing things. Do I go to this school or that school? And as I always tell them, it's not about just that question. There's so much more to it. What's the cost of attendance? What kind of goals do you have? And all those things kind of like change the outcome for every single person. And two people can be facing exactly the same decision and end up with different decisions, and both of them will be right. So it is really a matter of looking past the rankings and looking at things like the debt. But the reason I mention this is because I often look at it and say, well, if you're going to spend more to go to a particular school, if you're going to spend more to go to Penn or Columbia, what are you buying? And usually what you're buying is job outcome chances.
Mm-hmm.
You have better chances going to Columbia getting a big law job or a federal clerkship than you do if you go to, I don't know, say Emory, for example. No knock on Emory, another school I like. So it's just relative, and that's where you have to get into the numbers. And sometimes people tell me, I don't want to. I'm like, you need to, because you're going to be paying this debt load afterwards. Don't just take the best name, in your opinion, or in the rankings and wander off into the sunset, because you might find yourself seriously in trouble down the road trying to pay something off. With that caveat warning,
let's get into the thing I was most looking forward to, as I said early on here, which is let's break down some winners and losers throughout the changes we saw this year. We've run through some very school-specific ones. We'll come back to those as we go, but we'll also be able to talk, I think, a little broader about just the nature of movement here. Not just like this school changed this many points, it's a loser, it's a winner. You just did a really good job of that. But also looking at maybe why some of those factors have occurred, the factors behind why some of those movements have occurred, and also what that might mean for people either considering those schools or schools like them.
Yeah, and I think this will largely cover schools that kind of like go through the top 50 and a little bit to the top 100, and then we'll talk about some notable things that just happened overall.
Yeah.
But I love this format. You see it in a lot of different things. In sports, you often see it with like the NFL draft or the NBA draft. Who's the winner? Who's the loser? You want to start with the first winner? Winners?
Yeah, and this is a categorical winner, so I'm happy to do it. Really, all the schools at the top, as you said when we were talking about why the top 14. And I think I'm correct in saying this is maybe the only system of ranking where 14 has a significance to it. You see the top 10, Baker's dozen, Sweet 16 in the tournament. I don't think I've ever seen top 14. But anyway, why are the top 14 that way? It's largely been because of consistency, and the most consistent place has really been right up at the top, particularly the top 6. The only shakeup in that consistent top 6 was that Penn managed to find its way in it, in a tie this year. But to me, that's a winner. Those schools stayed exactly where they expected to be, we expected them to be. For everyone except for maybe Harvard, they're happy about it.
Well, I mean, at least Harvard's not unhappy. They're used to it. And they're Harvard, for God's sake. They have an endowment that's bigger than the size of this planet. So there's no tears here for them. But that is the case. You know, the biggest shock that we might ever see is something like Harvard all of a sudden is ranked 8th. Or Stanford is, 7th, that kind of thing. And that didn't happen. And again, for the last decade and for years prior to that, these schools that everybody knows, they are at the top. And of course, that's where the prestige factor comes in. Every place you go in the country, if you have a Stanford degree, they're like, oh, you went to Stanford. They know how hard it is to get in. They understand the quality of the student body. They know that it produces, quality students and quality lawyers
For
typically.
sure.
Yeah, and it's funny to me because I always think of Yale as being a little bit more philosophical and almost ethereal about their approach. It's not always the lawyers that are going to Yale. You see more politicians or people who are really trying to get into the judiciary and things like that. The cradle of Supreme Court judges.
That's a good way to put it. While we're on the subject of Yale, I have a question for you. Are
Mm.
they untouchable at number one? Could they ever be dethroned?
Um, Ever is a
I know.
long time. Do I think that they're going to be dethroned anytime soon? No. I've sent a lot of students to the top schools, and specifically talking about the top three, all three of them. And I've always found that Yale students seem to have something really special. And that's saying a lot
Yeah.
because I know the students I've sent to Harvard and Stanford are definitely special. They're already elite, but Yale just seems to be that place where sometimes I'm like, talking to somebody and then they tell me, yeah, I got into Yale. I'm like, man, I knew it. They've gone out and they've done like world changing things and they have abilities that are always amazing. And that is not to knock Harvard or
No,
Stanford.
of
I know a
course
bunch
not.
of Harvard, Stanford people are like, screw you, man. I'm not trying to say that. I'm just saying that they are a small school, especially when you think about how big Harvard is. And I think that if Harvard wanted to start competing at that level, and look, we're talking about 1 and 3 and two of the worldwide names
Right.
of schools. So it's kind of a joke for me to say compete at that level. They're at that level. But they could make that school smaller and probably start to really like give them a run for that first position. And they used to have that first position. So yeah, I think Yale could lose it. I don't foresee that anytime soon.
They shouldn't be looking over their shoulder. Fair enough. Yeah, what's their
Yeah, I
acceptance
probably
rate?
just
7% or something?
yeah, it's ridiculous. But Harvard could do that. Stanford could do it. It's just that they've settled into what they like. And, for a school the size of Harvard, it's one of the bigger law schools out there, kind of like Georgetown is one of the biggest as well. That's a really great financial
Yeah.
model for them. And they're able to maintain quality at Harvard. And again, this is not a knock on Harvard or Stanford. You get into those schools, my hat's off to you. That is an amazing and impressive feat. And I think people who go to Yale, in some instances, they really have different goals,
Hmm.
and it shows. Yale seems to have a really good system for finding those students. And just as a sidebar, the deans of admission at Harvard and Yale do a podcast together. I think we've mentioned it once before. I love that podcast. The two of them are great together, and they talk about the different needs and wants of their school and their different processes. They may be the top schools, but they treat things in a very different way.
Yeah.
And I think that shows in the students that they take. They're looking for something different at each school, although often that ends up overlapping because good people are just good.
Well said. All right. Let me set you up then with the first loser of the afternoon.
Oh, yeah.
Uh-huh.
Not the biggest loser, in my opinion, but the first loser.
Yeah, finish that statement, please.
First loser here, Northwestern. Uh, Last year, up to number 9, had to be pretty excited about that. This year, they fall out of the so-called T10 and drop down 3 places to number 12. The one thing I will say that tempers this is that they're back in a position where they've been mostly. I think 5 out of the last 10 years or 5 out of the last 11 years, they've been in the 12th position. So this is just kind of like returning to the baseline for them. So when we say they're the first loser, yeah, getting up to number 9 is great. You certainly get some accolades and recognition for that, but they're the first school that's gone down. But for anyone who's like, oh my God, Northwestern took a big tumble, I will point something out to you. Schools move.
Mhm.
Sometimes they move with a fair latitude and with a fair amount of frequency. You don't see it in the top 14 as much, but this is not abnormal for them. Northwestern is more often number 12 than not. So it's a loss for them, but it's not kind of like catastrophic.
Yeah, they were 12th as recently, I think, as 2017, where I'm sure they're maybe scratching their heads or hanging them a bit, is they had gone the past 3 years, they had gone 11, then 10, then 9, back to 12. So I'm sure the trajectory of this is a bit of a bummer.
Yeah, isn't there a Paula Abdul song like that? 3 steps forward, 4 steps back. Maybe that's not it.
Possibly. Is that the one with the cartoon cat video?
I think that's what it is. But the reference here is not to the actual song,
Right, no.
which is not 3 and 4, but to actually their position, movement, and so forth. But Northwestern, they're the first loser on the list because they've dropped out of the top 10. And on that note, John, who's the next winner?
I'm not even going to begin to try to take this from you.
It's not that big of a deal to me.
Take it anyway.
Next winner is Duke, man.
Mm-hmm.
Duke Law School, up 2 positions to number 10. And this is interesting. They get back into the top 10. They've got to feel good about that. But just like with Northwestern being in the 12th position, most years Duke is number 10 or 11 in the rankings. And so having been down to number 12, that was the lowest they'd been in a decade. And by the way, they've been as high as number 8 before.
That was 2016, I think, yeah.
Yeah, there's latitude here between the positions. Duke's been as high as 8 and as low as 12. So when people are like, oh my God, they moved 2 spaces, is that significant? No, only for this year. But they did move those 2 spaces. They got out of that number 12 position. They didn't drop any lower, and they moved up back into the top 10. This is what I would call their typical position so far. They've kind of established a number 10, number 11 spot. And this is part of the stability of the T14 that we see. So Duke, another winner. John, I'll tell you where Duke isn't a winner this year.
I know what
surprisingly.
You're gonna say. Yeah, where?
On the basketball court.
Yes. I mean, I knew what you were going to say, but still.
The season ended with ignominy and COVID test out of the ACC, and then they just shut it all down. They weren't getting in the NCAA anyway. So
it was kind of insult to injury at that point. They weren't in the tournament, and then they weren't playing.
I would actually argue they were the best team not to make it, but the one and done freshman situation really hurt them this year because they didn't get practice time. Mm-hmm. And they never started to gel until about February. I started to see signs of life, and at that point I'd written them off anyway. And ultimately the NCAA Tournament Selection Committee wrote them off as well.
Well, that's a shame for your boys, but maybe they'll pull a Virginia and win the whole thing next year.
We got a bunch of titles, more than Virginia, so I'm good.
Fair enough. Let's talk, while we're lingering around in the high T14, let's talk about a school that I think we could both consider a loser this year, which was Georgetown. They dropped out of the T14, down 1, so it wasn't too big a drop, fall from grace, but they are 15 this year. This has happened before, I think, as we touched on, back in 2018, so they go back and forth. But still, it's never a happy day when you look down and see your name out of the enviable 14 that you were in before.
Yeah, I think the fact that this happened a couple of years ago, I think Texas slipped ahead of them in 2018 to get that 14th spot. Georgetown dropped down, and then they fought back into the T14. Here, they've done it, and they've lost it again. They won't let that pass. They're obviously going to do everything they can to get back up because they know the value of that. So I wouldn't get overly concerned about it. Somewhat comically, the first message I got within minutes of those rankings coming out was, is this going to affect Georgetown's hiring going forward? And, this is exactly how people see it. And I think it's a totally legitimate question. When I got it, I was like, I get the question. And I was happy to answer it because I was like, no. And here's the reason. O'Melveny and Myers in Los Angeles isn't looking at this year's rankings. They already know Georgetown. They know it's a top school. If they see your name on the application and on your resume, they think to themselves, we know Georgetown's good. Let's sit down with this person. So it's a legitimate question. This is where it would be problematic if Georgetown kept slipping. And year after year, they kept going down and down and down. Because the first several years, it wouldn't have an effect because people would still know it. But eventually, people would be clued into the idea that there's something wrong. But you can bet that the administration of Georgetown is not going to let that happen. They may have slipped this year. They may be number 15 next year. Obviously, I have no idea whatsoever. But even that won't affect them. So if you're looking at going to Georgetown and you're like, they dropped, don't worry about it. They're aware of it. They know the value here. They'll, number one, work to turn it around. But even if they didn't this year, I don't see that as actually changing anything for them.
Yeah, I agree completely. Well, let's go back to a winner. Who took Georgetown's spot?
It's the school that you live nearby and the
right.
school that I know well. I've been to, thousands of times. I used to live nearby it as well. And that would be our friends in Westwood, UCLA.
That's right. The Bruins.
team that I'll be rooting for tonight against Michigan.
I was going to
for
say they're
pool
a double
purposes.
winner so far. They're having a good tournament, but I hope it ends soon.
Well, you want Michigan to
do.
win, and I would prefer UCLA because I foolishly took Alabama in this pool position. And they lost to UCLA, which I just thought was a ridiculous performance. But UCLA, to their credit, has played great. They've looked good. I hope they look great tonight. Watch that game later on, and hope to cement my pool status to invulnerable.
There you go. And to their law school's credit, this is the first time they've made the top 14, at least in recent memory. Not in the last, 8 years or so that I'm aware of?
Not unless at least,
Probably
I think,
longer.
10 or 15, maybe longer, or maybe ever. But they've moved up a position from number 15 into the number 14 spot, so they've made that. I'm sure there are celebrations in Westwood. Last night, those rankings came out at about 5:20 our time. They were very early. I would imagine they already knew from U.S. News giving law schools an advanced look at where they were, but we know that they were shuffling them around in the last couple of days. So they probably were like, we can officially crack the champagne.
Yeah, well, let's hope that's the only celebrating they do this week. Let's go to the next category of losers. You ready?
Oh, I'm ready.
I think it's a double loser group. There's George Washington and there's Emory. Both schools previously in the top 25 that have both slid down. George Washington 4 points and Emory down 5 points. George Washington's at 27 this year. Emory at 29.
It sucks to drop out of the top 25 because that's obviously a really big marker for a lot of students when they take a look at this. Each one of these T6, T14, T25, T50, T100, those are all markers that people actually look at, and part of the reason they use these rankings in the first place. So they're both out of the top 25, but John, I will say this.
Mm-hmm.
This is not their lowest ranking anytime recently. George Washington in 2018 fell to 30th and then obviously jumped back up.
Mm-hmm.
We know Emory had the same kind of situation. Back in 2012, they were 30th, and then they moved up from there. So if you are looking at those schools and you're like, I'm doomed. No, they fell this year. We've seen how compressed it is.
Right.
They can turn it around next year. It is really hard to use any kind of small jump or drop and think that it is decisive or determinative.
Well, really even all that significant or impactful, frankly. I mean, we're doing this because it's kind of fun to look at the movements, but I hope nobody's taking this as like, I can't pick a school from a loser group. Don't do that, please.
If you love DC and you want to be in the nation's capital and you're looking at jobs that relate to government and you have a real heavy interest there, you can't look at this and say, oh, GW fell out of the T25, I'm out.
Mm-hmm.
There are other reasons that you can evaluate a school both positively and negatively. This ranking system should not be something that's like, okay, that's it.
Yeah.
Let's go to a winner.
Ditto Atlanta, by the way, with Emory. If Atlanta's
another.
siren
You and I've
song.
talked about this.
Mm-hmm.
Both of us lived in Georgia. We met in Georgia, and I'm an Emory fan. I like the campus. I like the school, and they got a lot of Coca-Cola money over there in that business school too.
They do, yeah.
Let's go to, I think, one of the biggest winners in the last decade, and that is the University of Florida. I had a feeling this was going to happen again to them because Florida is on a tear,
Mm-hmm.
and it is a focused tear. And you're seeing some school systems, Texas A&M, who we're not going to talk about as another school that's putting money into the law school, and they're seeing some rises in rankings. Florida moves up 3 spaces from 24 to 21. And a lot of people would say, oh, okay, yeah, they're just still inside the T25. I'm going to go back in time here and kind of like outline their rise overall.
This is incredible.
In 2010, Florida was ranked 51st, and this is the Levin School of Law. By 2019, they'd moved up to 41st. By 2020, they were 31st. And now here we are in 2022, and they are 21st. This is the only school that I can really think of, aside from Arizona State, that has shown this kind of rise in the top 50. And both of these schools have made a concerted effort to increase all the metrics that U.S. News measures, which, by the way, is a really good indication that if you're a law school out there, this isn't random. You can actually put money into this and say, we want to change our ranking, and there is and are known systems for doing this. And so I know they, have consultants come in there and give them insights into what I should do and how I should do it, decisions to make. Well, guess what? It's paying off. And I'm well aware of how this is working for them and knew they were going to continue rising. The big question here with Florida is, can they keep rising?
How high can they go?
I don't know how much higher they're going to be able to go. We're reaching the point where the natural resistance of years of emplacement and quality now makes moving up a lot harder. It is much harder to go from 21 to 11 than it was to go from 51 to 41. Those spaces are easier when it's lower down and the competition is less. And they're starting to run into schools like Vanderbilt and some of the Boston schools and so forth, where it's like, it's going to be a challenge to continue to move up. But if they slip inside the top 20 in the next couple of years, I won't be surprised.
Yeah.
Do I think they're going to move inside the T14? No. They're always going to have a hiring problem because they're in Florida. They don't have immediate access to any kind of major market. Certainly not New York, which is the premier market in this country for legal hiring.
Yeah, it's not Gainesville. But, man, hats off to them. 30 places in 12 years.
Yeah, and by the way, ASU, Arizona State, in Tempe, a very hot campus. Been there in July. It was warm. My dad had a house in Scottsdale for years, so I would go there and I would always stop by Arizona State and just check it out and hang out. I like the school and I like the area quite a bit. In 2010, they were ranked 55th, and they are now 25th. So they've had a 30-point jump as well. Florida's just happens to be up a little bit higher than ASU. But ASU has a similar problem to Florida, not a great proximity to legal markets. And they're running into now a problem of name brand recognition. Mm-hmm. Every hiring firm knows Georgetown, but a lot of these hiring kind of partners don't know that ASU and Florida have made these kind of gains. And so it doesn't have the portability that you see with some other schools in similar rankings at this point.
Fair enough. But yeah, props to Florida. Let's look at two schools that struggled a little bit. Another pair of losers here. I'll start on my side of the country and then let you take the other one. How's that? Fair?
Very fair.
Fair enough. I touched on this school before and even referenced a student inquiry about it, and that is UC Irvine down the coast hour and a half or so from me, maybe. They dropped 8 points down to number 35. So they were 27 last year, down to 35. But I will say I think they're mostly just beginning to kind of find what is a fair ranking for them. They're a relatively new school. The very first rankings 6 years ago, I think they came in around 30. They've never really been lower than 30 until now, but they've hovered right around that mark for the most part. So I'm saddened, I think, to see them drop 8 points, because I do think they're probably better than a 35, but I don't know that they're better than a 25, which is kind of where they were close to last year.
They're an interesting case to me because for a law school to start up in 2016, at least for the U.S. News rankings in 2016, they started before that, and just enter at number 30, that's really incredible. But they've got the UC system resources, the University of California resources. We'll talk about that in a second. Yeah. They had Erwin Chemerinsky, a really well-respected legal mind and dean running the show. He'd been at USC prior to that. And so they had a lot of factors and a lot of support, and that allowed them to kind of like really kickstart it. And people were like, wow, UCI just blew the doors off as a starter. I remember seeing the 30 ranking and thinking, oh my God, they've come in ahead of schools like Davis and Hastings, which had been around for years. So they'd never been lower than number 30, as you said, and all of a sudden they are down to 35. So I'm sure that they will stop and, kind of review things and figure it out. But again, as we've already talked about, small changes can have big effects here. And so it's kind of like that butterfly effect. One little data point pushed them down. That also means it's easy enough to fix and make up. And I'll throw out a side note, too, about the UC system as well.
Yeah.
One of the big winners in this whole process was the University of California system overall. There are 5 law schools that are under the UC banner. UC Davis, UC Berkeley, Hastings in San Francisco, UCLA as well, and then UC Irvine. All 5 of those schools are in the top 50. And Berkeley held on at number 9. UCLA, we saw, was into the top 14. Davis moved up 3 places to 35. Hastings jumped into the top 50 with a 9-point gain. UCI was the only kind of like loser school.
Yeah, we're doing a lot of air quotes here, but yeah.
A lot of air quotes, yeah. Don't take that literally. Down 8 places. But that's 2 schools in the top 14, 4 schools in the top 35, 5 schools in the top 50. That's a really impressive performance for the University of California, despite what happened to Irvine. So overall, I think the UC system is also having a glass of champagne, toasting themselves tonight.
There you go, as they should be. I
Who's
like
the other
it.
school in that band that had
This
a
was what
problem?
I was going to say. Let's go about 3,000 miles distance to the east and talk a little bit about a school that we've referenced here as well, which is Fordham in New York. Exact same situation as Irvine. They dropped 8 points to 35 from what was 27th last year. What do you think caused it? Aside from what we talked about before, which is sort of an opportunity of big law hiring that's dried up a little bit in the last year.
Big law hiring, I think, had an effect. New York being down a little bit because of the pandemic. You also see debt. Fordham's expensive. They've got a lot of students come out with really high debt numbers. I think those two things help drive them down. This is kind of like the number 35 pair of schools that dropped down from 27 to 35, both Irvine and Fordham. Well-known schools at this point, but struggled a little bit in this particular rankings. I think what we're going to see is that Fordham will move back up.
I think so too.
There's a couple ties in front of them where schools are really bunched together, and so it won't take much for them to jump over those ties back into the mid-20s. Most likely when administrators see this kind of thing, and I'll point something out about that. Law school administrators definitely look at this. People lose their jobs over these rankings and sometimes get promotions over these rankings. And I think I saw that the dean of Temple, I think it was the business school, is going to be prosecuted on criminal charges for messing with the rankings. The data that was sent to U.S. News, it's turned into a criminal matter at this point. And so there's just some crazy stuff that happens with this, but it makes a really big difference to these people who are working in law school administration, which is, I mean, it's sad, man. This is a magazine that acts so high and mighty about our rankings, but you look at the data sometimes and I'm like, 3 recalculations prior to the release here and someone's going to lose their job over something like that? That's frustrating. And there's been controversy in the past. We've had other schools that have like fudged the numbers, as they would say, or misreported. And it's funny how that misreporting always benefits the school too, John.
They never misreport against themselves.
It's
Shocking.
odd, man.
Shocking.
Such a coincidence.
It speaks even more, though, to the slightly arbitrary nature of some of this stuff, or the subjective / grain of salt nature of this. If even the schools are willing to lie, how much can you really trust these things to make your final decisions?
You know, it's just like anything. People are like, oh, I trust the stock market. I'm like, really, Enron? You know, there's all sorts of counters to that. But in this particular case, a school like Fordham is well aware of what happened, but they'll probably naturally rebound a little bit next year with a little bit better hiring, and I'm sure they'll change a few things as well. Let's go to one of my favorite winners of this entire winner-loser group. And this was something that was pointed out by Karen Sloan of law.com. She wrote a great article about it, and I saw her highlight this, and I definitely wanted to highlight it. And that is Howard University. They have jumped up 16 places to number 91. And the reason that this is notable to me especially is that this is the first historically black college and university to have a law school in the top 100. And I think that's fantastic. Great to see them have a jump up like that. Obviously, there was a surge in people attending law school in general, and I think a lot of people really interested in some of the issues out there, and that certainly helped Howard as well. But congratulations to them. They're one of the big winners into the T100.
Absolutely. What we're going to start to see really is when we get into this range of schools, the 100 plus kind of range, is you start to see much more volatility from year to year. There's some really big swings that happen that wouldn't happen in, say, the top 20 or 50 even. To quote one here as one of the losers, as it were, is Chapman University, who actually dropped 23 points year to year. This is the largest drop, I believe, that we saw on the whole this year. They went down to 134. Which means last year they were sitting comfortably at 111. That's a pretty significant fall for Chapman there.
Oh yeah, 20%.
That's exactly
Out
it.
of out of 20% drop doesn't make anybody happy. So as we kind of like take a look at that, it's worth kind of talking about who lost the most overall, and that was the biggest loss by number of places dropped, down 23. So that was the largest drop over of the year. And John Chapman, South of you again. It looks like
Yep.
the Irvine Chapman access didn't do so well this time around. So sorry about the kind of like more Orange County-ish SoCal thing going on, whereas up at UCLA on the northern side, things were looking a lot better.
Says you. I yeah, says me, I suppose. But yeah, I still love Southern California down there. So again, these aren't the kinds of things that would talk me out of a school if I knew locationally they were in the place I wanted to be.
Yeah, and I think it's just like anything. You got to look at what you want, where you want to be, where do you want to work after you get hired, and so forth. Each law school has its own kind of like attractions and distractions and problems. You have to look at each one individually. But let's close out with the two biggest winners in terms of numerical increases. Two schools that I'm not as familiar with. The first one is the University of Missouri at Kansas City. That is up 22 places to number 111. I guess they took Chapman's
I was going to
spot.
say they swapped.
I don't want to down on Chapman. I feel bad for those folks. And then the University of Dayton. I've seen some good basketball from them in the last several years. They are up 22 places as well, this time to number 119. And those were the two biggest jumps of the year overall. So solid increases again, and just kind of fun. Again, is that really meaningful? Not really. It's just fun to kind of like say, well, what happened? Who went up the most? Who went down the most? Because this segment is called winners and losers,
Right.
and so there's gonna have to be winners. There's gonna have to be losers. I will point something out, which is that you look at the way rankings move around, and you think, does a school get demonstrably better from one year to the next? I would say largely no. Unless there's a big scandal or a big problem, that's not typically what you're going to see. But last year, there were 21 schools that either moved up or down by double digits, so 10 or more places. There were actually 23 last year. This year, there were 22 schools that moved up by double digits or moved down by double digits. It's all in one big group there. That really shows you how arbitrary this is, because I am not sure that Chapman did anything to deserve 23 places downward, nor am I certain that Dayton and UMKC did anything to deserve 22 places up, other than just kind of like the relative movement of numbers. And next year we may see them fall or rise depending upon the school. But that's kind of like the overall rundown of everything that happened in the T50 and then our personal winners and losers here. And we're certainly happy to debate any of our choices / decisions.
You touch on a point, and maybe we can kind of begin to close with this, which is that these don't necessarily reflect the nature of changes of the school. And I was going to say, when I was thinking about Irvine and Fordham, who both fell 8 points to 35 this year, the quality of education people are going to get this year, next year, and last year, that doesn't get affected by these things. The way in which the school itself is viewed or weighed changes as they put new criteria in, or they shift things around, or maybe the applicant pool shifts a little. But the school itself is still providing the same quality of education as always. The opportunities can change, debt now factors in, but look, if you had your heart set on a school and the ranking just shifted, unless there is some new metric within that that affects your decision, there's no reason your target school should change.
Yeah, look at jobs, look at debt, look at placement, geography, all those types of things. Let those numbers help drive. But most importantly, look at feel as well. If you can satisfy yourself on the front end of the data, go to the school where you feel the most comfortable. Because the key thing is that once you're in school, you do as well as possible. And as I often tell people, if you're comfortable at a location, you're more likely to do well there. So don't just say, well, I hate that school, but gee, their ranking is 3 places higher, so I'm going to go there. That's not a recipe for success. You want to feel good about what you're doing. You want to be confident with the choices that you make, with the debt that you're taking on, and so forth. That's how you make this decision. And again, that scholarship versus prestige blog, I repeat that advice over and over, but usually in specific as I talk about hiring numbers, big law, clerkships, debt, cost of attendance, all those types of things. So if you're thinking, I'm not sure how this works, go read the comments specifically in that blog. There are dozens and dozens of them. It will definitely help you get some insight into how this all works.
Yeah, you could sell that blog itself in the comments as a book, frankly. It's just a treasure trove of good advice and good questions, too. So I can't...
Can I make it a free Kindle book?
Who said anything about free? I said sell. Take the blog down now before we can't monetize it.
$1. All right.
That's great points. I don't have much else to add to that, aside from, again, the elements that make up a ranking are what matter much more than the number itself and how you weigh those elements versus how U.S. News happens to weigh them. And elements they don't include, those are the things really to look at here. So do
John,
that.
Should we do our own
right
rankings?
Place. Say that again?
Should we do our own rankings, you think?
Sounds like a lot of work, but yeah, we probably should. It also sounds kind of fun. Now that we've done this kind of micro-analysis of things, I'm enjoying it.
I wouldn't mind putting out a different set of rankings that everyone will ignore, of course, which is fine with me. I do think because I like to do them, not necessarily because some other people are going to like them or not. But I think we could do that and just kind of like disagree with them. Because I don't like the U.S. News rankings, and I never have. And I've always felt that it's just a shot in the dark a lot of times. Some of the stuff they measure, I'm like, really? Does it really matter? I mean...
You would have given library hours a lot more weight. Clearly. Shame on them.
Hey, no. I mean, look, does it make a difference? Yeah, if your library's open 5 hours total during the week, that's bad.
That's bad.
But at a certain point, does it matter whether it closes at 1 a.m. or 2 a.m.? I'm not sure that it does. There's certain things being measured here where I have to say you're measuring them because you can measure them, not because they have value. And that's the thing to be careful about with all these rankings. And on that note, I think we'll close it out. So if you get a chance, please subscribe to this podcast on iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, or anywhere else you may find it in the world. And if you've enjoyed it, please leave us a comment as well, and a rating, hopefully. And if you have any questions for a future episode, you can send those to lsatpodcast@powerscore.com. On behalf of John and myself, the top-ranked person in our NCAA pool is me. John, not top-ranked. That's our ranking system right now. We wish you a great week. We'll talk to you after the upcoming April LSAT. Stay safe.